Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast, where today's brightest minds in the medical device industry go to get their most useful and actionable insider knowledge direct from some of the world's leading medical device experts and companies.
Hey guys, welcome back to the podcast. My name is Etienne Nichols and I'm the host of today's episode. In today's episode, I got to speak with Mark DuVal and I spoke on the topic of ad promo and the difference in regulatory affairs and legal perspectives. Before I get into some of the things that we talked about, I want to give you a little bit of context about this episode because it's a little bit different. This episode was recorded virtually, but it was recorded in front of a live audience. So if you see some of us during the discussion talking about the comment section or some of the things people are asking or the questions, that's what that's about. Just full disclosure, as you're driving your car or listening to this episode, that's what happened there. Also, at the end of the episode, we opened it up for 30 minutes of question and answers from the audience. Now, that is not included in this episode or in this recording that is being published, so you won't have access to that. If you're interested in listening to that Q&A, let me know. We were planning to put that in the community just as a separate section, just so that you wouldn't have to be bogged down with those question and answers. It's very good stuff, but let me know if you're interested in hearing more about that. Okay, we covered a lot of ground. We talked about just a couple different things that came to my mind are things like, what are the 4 buckets of knowledge from information sharing? This is a fantastic framework that Mark throws out there. And he doesn't just throw it out there. He goes into very much detail about each one of these different buckets and his fantastic knowledge that he shares. Also, what's the difference in perspectives to consider when utilizing a regulatory consultant versus a legal advisor? They have 2 different perspectives. They're looking at it from 2 different directions. Both are very important, and we talk a little bit about that. Also, how should we think about the information that we provide with our medical device during the sales and marketing of medical devices? It's very important. Sometimes things that medical device manufacturers don't think enough about. We covered so much ground. Mark DuVal is fantastic. He's the founder and president of Duval Associates. He has over 20 years of experience in healthcare marketing and in advertising. He's a leading expert in medical device promotion, an attorney with so much experience. I first heard him speak at RAPS, where he is a fellow. He's a fellow at RAPS. I heard him speak in Phoenix, Arizona. I was very much impressed with his insights, his strategies, his ability to break down complex topics in a way that is easy to understand, to create a successful ad campaign that complies with regulatory guidelines and effectively communicates the value of medical devices to target audiences. So this episode is chock full of his expertise, his practical tips for creating what he calls an appropriately aggressive and effective yet compliant ad campaign. So don't miss this chance to hear from one of our industry's thought leaders. I hope you enjoy this episode with Mark DuVal on ad promo and the legal perspective in medical device development. Welcome to the Global Medical Device Podcast. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'm going to be the host of today's show. Today with us is Mark DuVal, the founder, president, and CEO of Duval Associates. He has over 20 years of experience in healthcare marketing and advertising. He's a leading expert in medical device promotion. I first met Mark at the RAPS conference back in September. Side note, he is a fellow at RAPS, the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society. So his presentation on ad promo there was outstanding. I was really excited to hear that. So personally, I've been waiting months for the opportunity to have another conversation with Mark. So Mark, I'm so glad to have you on the show today.
I'm glad to be here. It was fun meeting you in Phoenix, and it'll be fun doing this follow-on podcast.
So the topic that we have today is ad promo, just that's the short version, I guess. But before we get into the nitty gritty of that, we usually talk about quality or regulatory topics, but this is a marketing topic, but it is quality and regulatory. So maybe we could start out by talking about what ad promo is to MedTech and maybe why MedTech professionals should even be concerned with this.
Yeah, well, foundationally, once you get a device, the whole regulatory strategy that you have in order to get a device cleared or the grant of a de novo or approved as a PMA is to have a baseline representation claims that you can make about the device. And that you have to think that through very carefully because the more sophisticated your claims get, the higher up the regulatory pathway you have to go. And our job is, when we get involved with a company very early on and help them put together a submission or do the submission for them is trying to get, start with the end in mind. What is it you'd like to say this product does? And then we benchmark that against the competition, whether it be a predicate for a 510K or just another product that the de novo is close to or a PMA is close to, and have you identify what is it you want that product to say that makes you differentiable in the marketplace. And then we work with you to do sort of a regulatory assessment to say, well, look, there's a scale. If you want to make it a fairly pedestrian claim, inherit the underlying, basically the underlying IFU from another product on the market today, the intended use statement, then we'll take you down the 510K path. And the more extravagant that claim gets, or the more detailed that claim gets, the more it migrates from a tool to being a treatment, for example, the more likely you're going to challenge yourself to the edge of the 510K program, may end up on as being a de novo. Still a class 2 moderate risk device, but for which there's no predicate. And now you've inherited, instead of substantial equivalence as the standard for getting your product through, you're going to inherit the PMA standard of reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. But with a de novo, it's kind of like a PMA light in terms of the expectations for the quantum and the quality of the data you need to submit. So it's really critical for the company first to know what it wants to say about its product. And then when it gets that clearance or that granted de novo or that approval, then it comes in the magic of what the marketers would like to say beyond that, to extrapolate from that baseline intended use statement to what else can we say. And by the way, if we develop additional data going forward, what can we add to the promotional platform without upsetting FDA or violating the principle that we're outside the scope of our intended use statement that was granted by FDA? So, and from a quality perspective, we always tell people, frankly, that we don't like the promotional review process to be in the quality system. Although it is a quality to follow the claims matrices to make sure you're have fidelity to the claims that you're allowed to make. It is a quality-like system, but I never like ceding to FDA the authority under the quality management system, the right or the ability to look at promotional materials. Yeah, they'll assert that all the time, and companies do it all the time, so don't get me wrong, but we sometimes talk companies into having a separate advertising promotional review process that's like a quality system check, if you will, but it's not within the core quality system itself, because I never like to give the jurisdiction authority over advertising promotion to the FDA that easily.
Yeah, that's interesting. So before we go too far down, you and I were talking a little bit before we had this conversation about the difference in maybe what a regulatory affairs professional, their scope, and really perspective might be the word, versus a regulatory affairs attorney and the legal side. What are the differences in those perspectives? Because I think you've already kind of touched on it as far as where you house some of these documents, but how would you describe the differences in those perspectives?
That's a great question. And I don't say this by way of offending anybody, because there's no right or wrong. The regulatory affairs professionals are, a lot of times, they're biomedical engineers and scientists, and they are much more steeped in the medicine and the science than we would be as lawyers, although I've learned a lot through a 36-year career just through osmosis from some very smart biomedical engineers and scientists and physicians. But we tend to look at we're not very deferential to the agency. We know that the agency often exceeds its authority, its jurisdiction authority. So when we even look at advertising and promotion, they're often offending the First Amendment. And they've lost a lot of cases that have kind of forced FDA to reshape or rethink how they regulate advertising and promotion. But the general difference between, I think, a regulatory affairs professional and a lawyer is, I'll talk about this in the context of maybe the 510K program. When a regulatory affairs professional puts together a 510K, it's an evidentiary document. They're thinking very hard about all the evidence that they need to put in the framework that's given to them in the eStar program, or eCopy program, and they want to put it together kind of as FDA directs them to. And we don't think of it just as an evidentiary document, because there's a story to be told. We think of it as an advocacy document, owing to our lineage as lawyers. It's an advocacy document with evidence. So that's how we look at it. And we're just trying sometimes to help the regulatory affairs professional to say, don't just immediately assume that FDA's request for information or their perspective, for example, on the definitional elements of the 510K program, i.e. that you have the same intended use, that you have the same technological characteristics, or if you have different technological characteristics, that you truly are raising different questions of safety and effectiveness. You can push back and fight that. And that's what our job is. And we do that all the time. One other thing the FDA will always do is they'll start talking about, well, you need to establish 510K, the clinical benefit or utility for that device. And the immediate visceral reaction I have as a lawyer is, time out. No, we don't. We don't have to, as a 510K, when we choose a predicate, we inherit the underlying regulatory presumption that the predicate family has established the essential utility of the predicate family. and it's generally safe and effective. I just have to show as safe and effective as that predicate that I've chosen.
Yeah, give me an example of them maybe going further or asking for something based on the predicate. What are your examples?
Here's another idea. So there's a section of statute that came out during the least burdensome years when the least burdensome statute was being enacted, and then there were amendments. The FDA came out, there was a statute that industry asked for, and it's 513 I1E of the statute, and I roll that off because I deal with it so often on appeals. But under 513 I1E, the FDA is not allowed to assume a use for the product. So let's say you take a fairly modest pedestrian intended use statement and you just want to breeze through the 510K program and get on the market. And maybe in the future you have some idea for some other uses to which the device would be put and for which you will go back to the FDA in sort of a staged approach, right, to get additional claims. Well, sometimes in that initial submission, FDA will assume that you are going to claim uses that you're not yet claiming or you hadn't submitted. And when they assume that inflated use, which might be a treatment claim, for example, versus a tool claim, they'll then conjure up data requirements that meet that assumed use and are much higher than what you would do normally for the 510K claim you're seeking. So when they do that, they're violating the statute. They cannot assume an unstated use. Now, if they really believe that the product might be used there, they literally, under the statute, have to go to Dr. Shuren, the center director, for a finding that there's a reasonable likelihood that harm could result from this assumed use. And they can then make you add limitations of use to the labeling, but they can't preclude your clearance for that more pedestrian claim you're seeking. So that's just one example of many that we confront or face. When a company comes into us, they won't even see or identify these issues, and we'll go, yeah, here's an issue, and we need to attack it. And then we work a lot on least burdensome stuff as well when the FDA asks for more data than that to which they're entitled.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if we take this back to ad promo then for medical devices, I've heard you talk about 4 buckets of information. I wonder if you could expound on those 4 buckets of information flow.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm going to cheat by looking at some of my own slides as I do that.
All right.
I've taught this for years, and actually we wrote a chapter for a book. A lawyer is a good friend of mine from Epstein Becker out in Philadelphia. And we were asked for Food Drug Law Institute to come up with an analytical framework that would help marketers and regulatory affairs professionals understand how we communicate information broadly about a device or a drug, in that case, to the marketplace. And I created this 4 buckets of information flow. And when I teach courses on this, whether it be at Convergence for reps or it be for a client, we talk about the promotion of on-label information. Because, of course, fundamentally, we can only lawfully promote on-label, although hold that thought. I'll come back to that in a minute. Secondly, we talk about the dissemination of off-label information. And that was created back in the late 90s, early 2000s, where the FDA lost a major lawsuit or major case from the Washington Legal Foundation, which allowed us to engage in the exchange of medical and scientific information. So because it's First Amendment protected, FDA was never, a government agency is never allowed to act as a filter of what information is being exchanged in society, whether it be from a manufacturer to a consumer, a patient, or a manufacturer to a physician, or from a physician to a patient. They just aren't supposed to be involved. But what they can regulate is to ensure that what is being discussed is truthful and not misleading. So when you disseminate information about off-label uses of your product, you can do that. And FDA has 2 guidance documents that allow you to do that. One is on a reactive basis, where somebody unsolicited a doctor asks the company a question, and then the First Amendment door is opened, and you can respond to that with information that's tailored to the question that was requested. There's a second guidance document that addresses proactive dissemination, and that allows you to proactively send information out the door, usually from your medical affairs group, smaller companies that might be regulatory affairs or clinical or whatever, but you can send out affirmatively or proactively off-label information about your product. So that's bucket number 2, dissemination. Bucket number 3 is communication. That is a huge bucket. And I can't take the time, but it's informally safe harbored ways you might be able to discuss off-label uses with folks out in the medical community. And we cover under that bucket, which is huge, we cover press releases and social media and grants for physician-initiated trials on off-label uses, or grants for CME discussing off-label uses. Or maybe when you retain consultants under the auspices of a consulting arrangement, can you impart information about potential off-label uses in order to extract information about what the clinical study might look like, what the marketing messaging might have to look like, etc. That's a very big bucket, and we usually whiteboard with companies all the time on that one. It takes a lot of time.
And time out. So when you say safe harbor, I'm not super familiar with that term. What does that mean?
Well, that's a really good question. That is actually my construction. It's a figment of my regulatory imagination. In this case, there are safe harbors under the anti-kickback statute. I'm not going to get into that. But these safe harbors, these what I call informally safe harbored activities, are things that the FDA recognizes. Let me give you an example. When you do a press release about an off-label use, maybe you've got a cleared or approved product and it's on the market. And now you're studying that product for another use. And you want to do a press release talking about the enrollment of the first patient, or talking about the enrollment of the last patient, or talking about the results that have come out. The FDA tolerates in a press release the discussion of an off-label use because it's an informally safe harbored activity. They know under Rule FD, for example, of the Securities and Exchange Commission, publicly traded companies have a requirement to talk about information that might be material to an investing public. So they allow you to talk about futuristic uses of an already approved product that would otherwise be considered off-label promotion. And even when it's a privately invested company, it's not publicly traded, the FDA seems to extend that rationale that you need to talk to your investors and to the public generally about what your company is doing and what it's up to. So that's an example of an informally safe harbor. The other one would be when you do a consultancy. If you signed up somebody under a confidentiality agreement, a consulting arrangement, and they're sharing information with you and you're sharing information that, hey, we're going to pursue this off-label use or this new use, which is today off-label, but we want to get some information from you about what you think about how we might market that if our clinical trials come out appropriately, we get approved, we get on the market. And so you're engaging in off-label discussion before that product is actually approved for that use. But that's an informally safe harbored activity at that point.
Okay, that makes sense. So we have promotion of on-label information, dissemination of off-label medical scientific information, communication of on and off-label information. I might ask for some examples of those, but what was the fourth bucket?
Yeah, the fourth bucket, it's relatively new. It's not super new. It's been developing for a while, but it really solidified in 2016 with the Howard Root Vascular Solutions case, which is a very famous medical device case. But there's been a series of cases that the FDA has had to fight in court where both pharmaceutical and medical device companies have basically said, you're over-regulating free speech. So when you think about if you're disseminating off-label information, what makes that lawful? It's because if you're truthful and not misleading, if you have disclaimers and disclosures about the information you're about to share through dissemination, that's what remedies the fact that if you actually promoted for that use, the FDA would consider it adulterated and misbranded, send you a warning letter, and probably tell you to cease and desist, right? If you extend that thinking of dissemination to off-label promotion, you're asking yourself, if I can disseminate that information, why couldn't I promote it in the same fashion with appropriate disclosures and disclaimers, which make that otherwise off-label information actionable by the FDA on an enforcement basis? And it came about because, for example, in the Howard Root Vascular Solutions case was this really important case where the CEO and the company were basically criminally charged and civilly charged with having violated the False Claims Act and by way of using the mail and wire fraud, and that made it criminal. And Howard Root is a very brave CEO, and I know you're going to have him on in the future, but they spent $25 million in 5 years of their lives. I know the chairman of the board of that company at the time, and the board was behind it because they felt that somebody had to sort of get FDA under control. They were prosecuting Howard for allowing the organization, which he did not do anyway, for allegedly promoting an off-label use for the product. And for that, as a CEO, he was strictly liable. He was responsible. And they fought that in court.
So for the CEO to be strictly liable and responsible, what does that mean? Like, what's the potential implications there?
Well, there's a couple of cases, the Dodderwyk and the Park Doctrine cases, where we refer to as lawyers, where the FDA years ago established the fact that under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, if you as a responsible executive allow criminal behavior to go on underneath your nose, you are personally responsible for it. So if a sales rep, in the case of Howard Root, was arguably promoting for an off-label use of their device, then Howard Root as CEO is responsible for it. And he actually did the promotional programs because Howard is a lawyer by training. So when he would train the reps, he would tell them, you can't sell for this particular use in the perforator vein for the product. It was a very small little vessel. The product was used to ablate for varicose veins, basically. And the FDA had this idea in their heads, given the broad intended use statement that they were granted, that this little connecting perforator vein between the two major veins was off-label. And it didn't make any sense at all. And it was funny because on cross-examination, FDA's branch chief, the Howard Roots defense lawyer, essentially got the branch chief to admit it could be on label. So the case was done. But it took 5 years to get there.
Yeah.
And can you imagine how much you'd sweat and worry and how much Howard's wife worried for their future? But he was a very brave guy and just felt that he stood on principle and he won.
Yeah.
That's the fourth bucket. There is an argument to be made that if you do it carefully and appropriately, you can do that. And now let me add one more thing, Etienne, before I tell you. The reason I'm getting more confident in that position is that FDA in June 2018 put out a pretty good guidance document called Medical Products Communications that are consistent with FDA required labeling. And there, in that guidance document, they essentially enunciated the First Amendment standard. And I was excited because FDA, you finally getting there. You finally got it. And it's a good guidance document. Now, it's not broadly permitting you to promote off-label, but let me share one last thing. Here's how the courts look at it. FDA says, we don't care if the speech is truthful. The promotional speech is truthful. If under our jurisdiction and authority, it's adulterated and misbranded, you didn't come to us for clearance or approval, then you've engaged in criminal behavior. You're illegally promoting off-label. And the courts sort of switch that around. They say, you got that wrong, FDA. Your statute sprung from something called the Constitution, which is pretty much bedrock for the country. The Constitution gives us the First Amendment. And if the speech was truthful and not misleading, then you cannot prosecute truthful speech. And that's the tension. And once FDA finally figured out the courts were immovable on that concept, they started moving and they got more permissive in this arena.
I see. Interesting. So I'm going to take a quick moment real quick because you've mentioned a lot of things. One was the book that you helped co-write. I'm bringing this up to say in the show notes, those of you listening, if you're interested in hearing more about this, we'll put links to the guidance documents of off-label dissemination for reactive and proactive, as well as the Medical Products Communications Guidance Document and Cardiac Arrest, Howard Roots' book. I have it on my desk right now. I'm working through it. It's a great book. Highly recommended. Yes, he is going to be on the podcast before too long, so I'm excited about that. Okay, so from a medical device professional perspective, I typically think, okay, but I really have to be careful with what I say. What you're saying, it almost flies in the face of what I've always heard about any kind of communication about these different aspects. So you have a good relationship both with the agency and with the industry. I'm curious, what are the best recommendations for regulatory affairs professionals when they're approaching these subjects? Obviously, we don't want to just assume that we can promote off-label. We have to be careful, but what's the advice and recommendation you have about that?
That's funny. I just got off the phone late last night with an Australian company talking about this. The natural tendency or proclivity of regulatory affairs professional, again, is to be fairly deferential to the agency. And they should. We all should. I have great relationship there. I really love working with the agency. I respect them greatly. But my job is to challenge. And I'll tell you what, by way of an example, years ago when I was general counsel of 3M's pharmaceutical business, I was asked by the executive committee of the law section of PhRMA, the big trade association for the pharmaceutical industry, to debate a woman named Ann Witt, who was a JD, a lawyer, who was head of the Division for Drug Marketing, Advertising, Communications. It's now called the Office of Prescription Drug Products. But the reason I was asked to debate them is because FDA at that point was taking the stance that the industry could not do, listen to what I'm about to say, the industry could not do direct-to-consumer advertising. Now, I'm going to look you in the eye, Etienne. I'm going to ask you, how many TV ads for drugs have you seen in your lifetime?
Couldn't even say.
But that shows you how the agency has morphed over the years. They didn't want you to disseminate off-label information. They didn't want you to engage in direct-to-consumer advertising. And frankly, it was the Federal Trade Commission, who I remember assigning a employee to the FDA to help them, nurture them to come along to accept the idea. You got to allow companies the patients want it. You got to allow companies to advertise. Now, there needs to be in a format that we have to agree upon. And that's why you see all of those, both the benefits and the risks are juxtaposed in the course of the ad. The risks will scare you to death. And then they've had to transition that to social media, where you might be character limited. So you used to be 144 characters, now it's 300, some whatever. And how do you get the fair balance of risks and benefits? indications, the contraindications, the side effects, the precautions, the warnings, etc. FDA has morphed in an amazing fashion over that time, and they did a much better job with social media. Once the dam was broken, if you will, direct to consumer, and they accepted that we're going to have to do that, and they issued guidance on how it could be done, then they segued into social media a lot more readily and did a pretty good job of it, frankly.
That makes sense. So you mentioned the fair balance part, and I just want to kind of circle back to that because you mentioned a couple times truthful, not misleading, fairly balanced, but the fairly balanced. I wonder if you could expound even a little bit more on that, or maybe any of those that might have any kind of subjectivity to the term.
Absolutely. So always keep in the backdrop is kind of a mantra I make everybody repeat when I do a training exercise. I make them repeat after me: truthful, not misleading, fairly balanced. Seems simple. And all of the food, drug, and cosmetic advertising promotion hangs on that general principles. We all, I think, kind of know what truthful and not misleading is, and government regulates that, whether it's a consumer product or a drug or a device. But when you get to the point of fair balance, it just means the FDA, I'll give away an example. When I used to review promotional materials for marketers, back in the days when we had a lot of sales collateral material and they had a 6-page piece, right? And you open it all up, they'd have all the benefits on the first 5 pages. And then you knew it was on the back side, right? Or maybe on the inside cover of the back, because they didn't want it to be on the back because that was easily seen. All the risks in small print at the bottom of the page. And the FDA say, wait a minute. We want fair balance. We want you to juxtapose this benefit with this risk, this benefit with this risk, and so on and so forth, all the way through the piece, and make it sure it's readable and it's legible, and make a fair attempt. Again, it's all about context, and that's part of being truthful, not misleading, is you want to leave a fair impression about what the product is and does and what it is not and does not do.
So with social media, though, I mean, you mentioned the character limits, but there are other ways to interact on social media with emojis or thumbs up and things like that. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit trail necessarily unless you want to, but how does the agency look at that? What are the people who could be held liable in those cases when they're interacting on social media?
Yeah, social media has been a very good and a difficult thing for people like me at the same time, because how do you help people navigate, Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and whatnot? Yeah, and Twitter there's been a number of promotional warning letters that have been sent out where the thumbs up has gotten companies in trouble, because there'll be this discussion that ensues online in social media, and then the marketer from a company or a sales rep just cannot contain themselves, and they say, well, I'm on my private time. I'm on social media now, and I'm going to defend my product. And if I hear about an off-label claim being made about my product and how safe it is, I'm going to put my thumbs up. And FDA has actually issued warning letters for companies kind of setting up that venue or participating in a venue they didn't set up, but being effusive about commenting on or putting thumbs up, agreeing with off-label uses and things. You have every right to participate in social media, but again, you're still regulated, and your employees are still regulated because they're representing you, the company. So you have to be careful about how you participate in social media. There's a lot of nuances to that, and I won't drill down on that right now unless you ask me a question that forces me to do it.
Okay, and maybe that question will come up. I don't know. We'll see. But if we go back to that 4-bucket of information flow, because I really love that framework, I still think, so the dissemination of off-label medical use or the communication of on and off-label information, can you give some examples of when that might come into play, or could you expound on that?
Yeah, and I'm going to actually get myself down to that slide for my own benefit because it'll help me know what I'm talking about. Because I do put actually a lot of things in there. I might not even have it. Yeah, I have it right here. So dissemination is a really helpful exercise. It's kind of obtuse, indirect marketing, but you have every right to do it. So if there's a peer-reviewed journal article that comes out on a use of your product on an off-label use, you can exchange that. And FDA has, like I said, these 2 guidance documents. One of them allows for the proactive dissemination, which I really like. And so when the Washington Legal Foundation case first came out, Judge Lamberth kind of set the stage for what he thought dissemination should look like. And I remember FDA, actually, because I used to teach for about 5 years, I taught with a woman named Deb Wolf from FDA and a promotional advertising policy group for CDRH. And I remember one time Deb coming to me and saying, hey, the FDAMA, which is a statute that allowed for off-label dissemination, was sunsetting. And we've got this WLF case, and I was told to ask you, what would you think we should do? And I'm an N of 1 in terms of input, right? But they asked me, so I would take the Washington Legal Foundation case and I would basically memorialize that into a guidance document. It's pretty good. Covers a lot of great ground, and I think it's a great starting place for us as an industry And the FDA did that. It is pretty good. It's a little even overbroad from a constitutional scholar standpoint, but it's livable. It's doable. So what happens is, basically, if you want to disseminate information, you can mail it out. Like we used to do it at 3M. The very first time the WLF case came out, we took basically a folder. And at the top of the folder, it had the name of the publication, or the article, and the authors and the publication where it was published. At the bottom, it said 3M Pharmaceuticals. You open it up in these two sleeves, and on one sleeve, you have a letter from the assistant medical director that said, hey, this is an off-label use of this product, and the on-label uses are in the package insert stapled to this letter, and you could get the package insert for that product. And then the right side, we had a bibliography of articles that were pro, con, or indifferent about the use of this device in that off-label use to be fairly balanced. And there was a sticker on the actual reprint on the top that was yellow with black lettering that said, this is an off-label use of X. For the full prescribing information, please see whatever. So it's prominent and it's permanently affixed, that article. That is off-label dissemination. And frankly, most of my clients that I counsel today do it just about like that. We're a little simpler version of what FDA's guidance says. Remember, FDA's guidance is not binding, and I think it's a little overbroad. But we meet the essentials, and my clients have never been in trouble doing it the way we've done it, and they've been doing it, for 25 years.
That makes sense how you laid that out. But I'm curious, what are some of the things that you see companies doing incorrectly? Maybe they're thinking, okay, I'm doing exactly like Mark's described, and then you notice, well, you messed up here. Are there any things like that you see?
Yeah, most definitely. One big pet peeve for FDA is when you have a cover page. First of all, you don't say it, you just start handing stuff out without any disclaimers or disclosures at all. And then they'll have a cover page that sort of does their sales distillation of what this article says. And some of it may be right on and some of it may be really off. And there's no fair balance. It's all about the benefits, nothing about the risks. And that bothers FDA when it's done like that. There's a lot of ways you can mess it, but FDA's got pretty understanding that this is the world we're in and that the First Amendment does permit. And look, we should want medical professionals to have the most recent information about products because it does help them make decisions. Now, what they also don't like is when you hand out these glowing articles, knowing full well there are articles that are in contradistinction, and you're not handing those out with them, or at least making people aware of that counterbalancing information. Again, that's kind of violating the overarching principle of fair balance, right? We want to state both the benefits and the risks.
Okay. So that's dissemination. How does that differ from communication of on and off label?
Yeah, communication. Is it hard to put up a slide here?
Shouldn't be. There's a video button and the gear button. There's a little square with a dot in the middle. Do you see that?
With an arrow?
Yes.
Yep. So this is what I'm talking about. This is the presentation. I think I made this one for Convergence. It's probably the one you saw in Phoenix. So this communication bucket is, I talk about when it is informally. Again, it's not written any guidance document or anything else. But when it's informally safe harbor and when is it promotion? And we try and help people, and we whiteboard. I'm going to just go there quickly and then come right back. We try and whiteboard with the possibilities for folks. And by the way, here's the slide on that you were talking about with the buckets. There's 3 and then there's a 4th now. But let's go back. We help people whiteboard the ideas. But I talked about press releases, for example. Normally, you can't just send out a white paper that's about an off-label use. You're probably mail it out to folks. That would be illegal off-label promotion. But if you do it in the form of a press release as part of your public relations effort, the FDA does give permission to do that. There are things that you can do on the internet. For example, if people come up and talk about your product being in an off-label use, you might be able to join in that conversation, say, I just wanted you to know that this is an off-label use. And by the way, there are articles that address this if you would like to use. Then that may be permissible. On your websites, you can have a repository for clinical data from and maybe other publications that address an off-label use of your product. Now, if you had it on a banner page up front and you kept splashing, use it for this off-label use, that might be a problem. But if it just came out, you might be able to have a splash page, but then that has to go away eventually. And then it gets relegated to the back room of clinical trial, the library, if you will. So in all of these are opportunities to think through, like everybody asks, can I train on off-label uses in physician training? The answer is absolutely and unequivocally no, you cannot. But you are going to get off-label questions. So you have to think through, how am I going to handle that? And then a notice of availability, for example, is when you want to advertise because you're recruiting clinical investigators and there's FDA guidance on this, you want to advertise for clinical investigators. In that advertisement, you might have to juxtapose on one side of the page the on-label uses for which it's currently cleared with the off-label uses that you're seeking to enroll in a clinical trial. And you're telling the physicians, maybe it's on the back of a cover of a magazine, and you've got this ad, and you're saying, we're recruiting for investigators for the following intentional use. Maybe it's for a back of a spine magazine or whatever. We try and help people be creative without violating the law. And in fact, our tagline for our firm is, we help you be appropriately aggressive, yet compliant. We don't feel people should unnecessarily leave money on the table, nor should they foolishly aggravate FDA and receive a warning letter and get told to cease and desist. So we try to help folks navigate that middle ground.
I'm curious if you ever see exploding heads in the audience when you're teaching this, because it does seem, I mean, it's aggressive, but it's appropriately aggressive, and that's interesting.
No, it is. And yeah, I see it all the time. In fact, probably two other convergence meetings when I think we were in Vancouver. There were a bunch of FDAers in the audience, and I think they were taking umbrage at a lot of what I was saying. And I went up and talked to them after, because I really love working with FDA. They are great people, and their mission is different. But I've never been in trouble with the agency. A lot of times, sometimes we'll even send them letters in advance about how we're viewing our intended use statement and where we're going to be promoting, and to say, if you disagree, let us know, kind of thing. So we work a lot with the agency, and they're very good to work with. They're not always going to agree with you, but they're good to work with.
Yeah, I think it's a fair and balanced approach that you have to. I mean, they have their job, but we also, everybody has their different perspective and job to work through that. So I'm curious, again, so when you talk about these different off-label uses or things that are maybe coming up, and you're putting those in, not necessarily on the splash on the front page of your website, but you're hearing and getting more information from the industry about other uses of your product, there's got to be an approach, or maybe this is a question. What is the approach a company should take in regards to timeline to creating a new submission versus just continuing to sort of go ahead and do this dissemination and communication of off-label use? What about eventually a new submission? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, well, a lot of times, especially in the 510K world, well, even in the de novo world, we often are counseling clients, if they don't have the money or the financial wherewithal to go for the home run at the beginning with the big indication that they really think this product deserves and will serve, where a lot of times we just say, let's just do a two-stage strategy. Let's get you on the market for a more limited claim and start generating some revenue so that you can pay for the longer-term clinical studies to put the product in the segment of the market where you really want to be, which is also the largest or the most lucrative or whatever. So we work with companies all the time. In regulatory strategy, again, we ask them to begin with the end in mind. What is it you'd like? What, in an ideal world, if you could say, this is what I want to sell the product for? And then let's work our way back to reality. Sometimes that is reality. Sometimes it's not at all reality, and we have to work our way there. I can give you an example on Coaxia, a company I worked with. Tremendous company, got 2 510Ks and an HDE for cerebral vasospasm, and then was headed for a PMA because they wanted the product, which was straddled the renal arteries in dual balloons that, when inflated, would straddle the renal arteries and redirected blood flow to the upper extremities, the brain, the heart, and the lungs. Really cool product, and an evolution, in the next evolution in the line of products that were there at the time. And they wanted to get another PMA, and they had a 515 patient study, and the efficacy was there, or wasn't, the safety was there on a 2-to-1 margin. The efficacy just missed barely, but they accepted an endpoint, a return to normal for an ischemic stroke patient, which wasn't very realistic, but yet they almost hit it, but they fell short. And so what do? You get a 515 patient study, you've nailed safety, and then you've got effectiveness, which just has fallen short. So on a PMA basis, you're not going to get the claim that you wanted. So they backed down, and they came to us, and they tried to get a 510K, and they failed on that. And then I was hired to argue on appeal to get them their 510K, and we came up with a compromise, which at the time I thought was good. It was like 11 years ago now. Dr. Maisel offered a de novo panel meeting, which in retrospect was the biggest mistake you could ever make. And the reason is, when you hand a device to a panelist, a PMA type panelist, and FDA has these folks that they use repeatedly, they're lost in a world of biostatistics, and they think big, right? They think PMA. They never can dumb down the framework. I just did a 510K panel meeting a year and a half ago. Same thing. They could never think in the framework of the 510K program, or in the case of Coaxia, the de novo, and they could never look at the probable benefit has to exceed the probable risk. And it's a lesser standard than a true PMA. and it's a class 2 moderate risk device. And we tried to explain that and how you have special controls become a surrogate for the establishment of reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. And we really tried to explain that to the panel, kind of to no avail. They could not divorce themselves from this grandiose, very granular biostatistical look at the data. So that's an example. And we were trying to say, look, this data has substantial worth. It's a 515 patient study following on 2 510Ks and an HDE. This product, all we were trying to say is it could be used with, not necessarily to treat, ischemic stroke patients. It's a very modest, and we gave them an example of another predicate at a similar type of claim, very closely aligned therapeutic segment. But the panel didn't buy off on it, the FDA didn't buy off on it, and Bill and I still need to have a talk about what happened at that panel meeting. I really do consider Bill a great friend. He's been a breath of fresh air to the agency ever since he's gotten there. And I said at the MDMA meeting a couple of weeks ago, talking about the de novo program with Peter Yang, who's the program lead for the de novo at CDRH. I said to the audience, that Dr. Maisel, we really appreciate the fact that you take appeals and you do overturn staff from time to time. And when you don't overturn them, you find compromise. Because as you do that, you're teaching them. That is now cascaded down to some of the office directors, not all. Some of the office directors are very Maisel-like in their decision-making. They're very fair-minded. They really apply the law and the guidance, regulations and guidance strictly and fairly. And it's even seen it trickle down to some of the, what we would call branch chiefs. They're called division directors now. And because we can't have all these decisions funneling up to Bill Maisel. And he's been deputizing Owen Ferris to hear some of his appeals, but all of it can't go there. We need to push it down. And hopefully the training on the contours of the 510K program definitional elements will get down to the review staff. The review staff are getting smarter about that, they're knowing it, but they take a position and they're not open-minded. Once they've taken a position, and it's usually conservative, they're locked in and you're not going to move them at all, and probably not the division director either. And so you're on a path that has to take you up. So we try and get involved really early on in 510Ks if we're not submitting them ourselves to help people understand, to give kind of strategic direction.
I might ask, just maybe a tweak on the question I asked. So suppose a company they're already commercial, but then they start to detect other uses out there, maybe off-label. And I guess it's a business decision. I guess it would be to determine an ROI decision to determine whether or not they want to have a new submission. Is that the thought there in that situation? Yeah.
No, absolutely. It's financially driven, and sometimes they're doing just fine, just leaving the product where it's at and let them, the off-label use, if you will, become commonplace. That's where most off-label uses are discovered anyway. It's by the medical community. It says, hey, if it is beneficial here, I apply a medical extrapolation, a logical medical extrapolation to apply it over here. Yeah. And sometimes companies say, we need to get this on label so that we can actually promote for this use.
That makes sense. Another thought is, so I know Europe, it requires a little bit more real world data. I'm curious if FDA is moving towards that a little bit as well, or do you have any thoughts around that?
Yes and no. Dr. Shuren just recently, I basically had an appeal ongoing, and it had been decided by Bill Maisel, remanded, if you will, to the office director. So a very high-level person, one of the OHT1, Office of Health Technology people. It wasn't one, it was one of the OHTs. So he, in a sense, acted like a judge would do. He decided the case, if you will, in our favor, then remanded it, if you will, down to be handled. And then the trial court judge, if you will, or the office director didn't handle it so well. And so one of our people who was the regulatory affairs person from the company he was actually a consultant for the company, saw Dr. Shuren speaking at one of the conferences. And afterwards, she got first in line. She said, Dr. Shuren, we have this situation. We're stuck, and we've offered real world evidence. And you spoke glowingly and how important it was to the agency that you're really going to move there and whatnot. But, and he said, fortunately, he got tangentially involved and just got Bill involved again, re-involved, and it's all resolved itself. But the point is, the FDA talks a lot about real world evidence at the Shuren-Maisel level. And, when they're talking to the public and to Congress and whatnot. But when you're in the trenches day to day, trying to convince them to use something that's real world data is work. It can be done though. And we have done it, but you've got to be really particular. And what they're really concerned about, of course, with real world data is if you're retrospectively dredging up data, they want the study design for the retrospective dredge, if you will, to be prospectively designed. and to do its very best to eliminate bias and cherry picking of data, insights, and because you've got data out there where people have been using the product. They might have medical images that can be harvested and good data that osmometry indexes that have been filled out or whatever. There's radiographic data, images. There's a lot of stuff that really can be good, and then you can use it. But the FDA wants to know it has some integrity. And they truly are getting better. And pre-submission meetings, they're getting pretty good at helping us. I had one cardiovascular client where we actually negotiated a real-world study against an index or a registry that's been going on for decades, or a decade at least. And we're going to be able to compare against that. And I'm really excited. It's a propensity scoring data. It's really exciting. And the FDA is really working hard with us. And I'm very proud of them. It's Bram Zuckerman's group. And so, yeah, there's success stories. But I think we've got to get the desire to accept real-world data from the top-level folks down to the trench-level folks and middle management.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Before we go to Q&A, do you have any other thoughts, recommendations for regulatory affairs professionals, MedTech professionals, an approach to ad promo, just any general advice that you typically hear questions on? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think your management will value you. They know you know the regulations and the law and what, but where they're really going to value you is when you can become creative and help them get to their goals. So, and firms like us are here to help you. But even I know some law firms that are still as conservative as the FDA. I just think you need to open your mind and think is this possible? Ask the question. Don't just be immediately dismissive of sales and marketing saying, here we go again. They're always pushing the envelope or whatever. Just ask yourselves, I'm not going to be so negative about this. I'm going to ask myself, is this possible? And then if you don't have it, you don't know if it is on your own, get help. And there are folks out there that can help you brainstorm. And that's, like I say, that's why we do these whiteboarding exercises all the time, because we literally will sit down. I'll go out to a company and I'll do a didactic for 2 hours. And what's the landscape that they're going to encounter in advertising and promotion from an enforcement standpoint? And what is the FDA's expectations? When I say be truthful, not misleading, and fairly balanced, that's the framework. But there's a lot of stuff that comes out of in the regulations, in the guidance documents, you glean from warning letters and all sorts of stuff that tell you what FDA's interpretation of things really is. But if you whiteboard, we'll do, like I say, we'll do a 2-hour didactic. We'll do 3-4 hours. I'll just say to the marketers, throw it all on the table. What are your ideas? Let's whiteboard stuff right now. What would you ideally like to do? And let's start the path on figuring out how we can do that. And we've done that. We've had 1,254 clients. So not all of them have been advertising promotions. Some of it's on the submission side, but we probably have an N of 800 on this. So
that's pretty good. And one last thought on that. So you'd mentioned the general and specific use. I know you have a good illustration of the umbrella term. I wonder if you can just dive into that in the next 5 minutes. Yeah,
I can even go up there and do it. Am I making people dizzy doing this?
I threw you all over the place. Sorry to do that to you, Mark.
That's all right.
If you're okay with it, we'll provide these slides as well if people are interested. Okay.
Yeah, well, these are convergent slides. Let me put the opening slide for you. I'll recreate the opening slide so it's not stolen from wraps technically. So here's where FDA starts. And we never had these two definitions before. FDA used to talk about, and people still confuse, intended use versus indications for use. So technically, the statute and the regulations talk about intended use, which just is nothing more than the general purpose of the device or what it does. And then it encompasses the subsidiary indications for use. And the indications for use then is defined to mean the disease or condition the device will diagnose, treat, prevent, cure, or mitigate, including a description of the patient population for which the device is intended. I will note one thing here. Notice the word treat here. And so I'll show you some stuff here in a minute. The difference between tool and treatment. FDA gravitates in the 510K toward a tool. Frankly, they do allow you to say something about what it treats. And so they have trouble. I have a recent case appeal that we won at the office director level where they have now permitted us to use basically a treatment type of claim. Without giving it away, I can't describe it. But this is what you were looking at, and this is from one of our client alerts. I've been using this umbrella for, at least 20, maybe 25 years to describe. And now Marjorie Schulman at FD used to use this, director of the 510K program operations staff. She just retired, but she used to give me credit from the audience when I was in the audience for this, because I always think visually, guys, just so you know. I think of the general intended use as being the umbrella. This is the umbrella that you were handed by FDA. And I'm fond of saying that FDA is fond of giving you a general intended use statement that suggests the product can be used for just about everything, but then they tell you that you can promote it for nothing. So it's very difficult. It's frustrating for marketers. And so the umbrella contemplates a lot of subsidiary indications for use that would be on-label indications. If you think of the umbrella protecting you from the elements, you're under there and you're staying dry and you're okay. But if you get too far afield, you're out there on the edges of the umbrella, you're exposed to the elements, you're off label and could get a warning letter, and then certainly you probably have to do a de novo or PMA to get that indication. So the way FDA breaks it down is analytically is one old guidance document plus their 2014 510K guidance document, but they have this old one that they still use. It breaks it down into levels of specificity. How specific are you getting with your claim, from all the way from identification of a function like cutting down to an effect on a clinical outcome. And then the second one are these decision-making criteria. And there's 7 of them, and they look at risk, they look at public health impact. In other words, how much more risk does the specific use entail versus the general intended use? They look at the knowledge base of the medical community. Can they use the specific use just like they would in the general? It doesn't change. What endpoints apply to your studies that you've done or the data you have apply to specific use? And then this famous tool or treatment one, you'll see this in warning letters. You'll see it in AINN letters. They'll come back to you and you think, well, we think you're really making a treatment claim, and if you are, you're going to be a de novo or whatever. So that's kind of where FDA goes with it. The classic example is the ablation devices. They first were cleared to ablate soft tissue. That was the umbrella. Then they started saying, well, we ablate cardiac tissue. Now that's on the edge of the umbrella. And then they started saying, well, we're used to treat atrial fib. And that got you out in the treatment realm, and that was off-label, and FDA retrenched and said, oh, time out, we've gone too far. Does that help answer that question?
Yeah, it does. And I guess one of the other questions, maybe follow-up, is why would you want to be very specific with your indication of use? Would that be to reduce some of the testing load in the submission, or what are some of the reasons you might want to do this versus that?
Absolutely. So at the de novo program, I talked about being tethered to a pole. You know, 510K to the FDA is like being tetherball on a tether pole. They can only ask for data, you can only in the potential sphere of where the tetherball goes in the pole is the predicate. They really shouldn't be going any further than the predicate did. And they're often trying to do that. The FDA is often trying to shore up predicate families by asking for clinical data that has never heretofore been requested, or maybe biocompatibility data beyond which has been requested, or bench testing, animal data, whatever. They'll ask for more and more and more, almost endlessly. It's a mindless escalation of data requirements. And when you get them to think about it, and you say, well, hey, we're on the 510K, and here's what the predicate family has established, you have under least burdensome requirements, principles, you have a strong argument to argue them down and to stay tethered to the tether. If they define you off the 510K path and you're in the realm of de novo, and I hate to say this, they say they wouldn't be biased by user fee economics, but they get about $100,000 more, and they aren't tethered to the pole anymore. Now they're in the realm of PMA land. It's reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, albeit applied to a class 2 moderate risk device. So it's kind of a PMA light standard. It's more than a 510K, but less than a PMA. And so that's what's transpiring there.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, this is great. I know we're kind of at time for this section of the podcast, so I really appreciate you coming on the show. And yeah, I'm excited for future events. I know we have TQR, True Quality Roadshow, coming up in Minneapolis with Howard Root, so I'm really excited to see you in person there. So yeah, thanks again, fun. Mark.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. A few of the points that I took away from this conversation are: one, we talked about the 4 buckets of information sharing at the beginning and then throughout the episode, and they all have their place. Number 1, the first one being promotion of on-label information, whether it's general or specific use, the dissemination of off-label medical scientific information, and then the communication of both on and off-label information. And then the last one, which he says is relatively new, the promotion of off-label information. So fantastic takeaways. I really enjoyed the 4 buckets of information that he shared. One of the biggest things to think about is that the information you provide has to be 3 things: truthful, not misleading, and fairly balanced. He said, if you listen and you hear and remember anything, remember that the things that you share have to be truthful, not misleading, and fairly balanced. Fantastic. I also loved his umbrella analogy, which if you haven't gotten a chance to go over to Duval Associates and sign up or subscribe to their client alerts, This is inside one of those client alerts. It's a very well done publication that they do and provide to their clients. He has an umbrella analogy. The point is that your on-label indications should stay under the umbrella of your general intended use. There's so many links in the show notes, so be sure and check those other resources out. We shared guidance documents. We shared a link to Howard Root's book, which I'll be interviewing Howard Root in Minneapolis in a few weeks at our True Quality Roadshow. So if you haven't got a chance to check that episode out, likely by the time you hear this, it will have been released. So check that out as well. If you enjoyed this episode, reach out to Mark DuVal on LinkedIn, let him know. Also, I'd personally love to hear from you via email, etienne.nichols@greenlight.guru, or look me up on LinkedIn. Let me know if there are other specific topics that you'd like us to cover or specific experts you'd like us to interview so that you can hear more from them. Lastly, if you're interested in learning about our software built for MedTech, whether it's a document management system, CAPA management system, or an electronic data capture for your clinical investigations, or your design controls and risk management software, let us know. This is software that's built for MedTech professionals by MedTech professionals. You can check it out at www.greenlight.guru. Lastly, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes. It helps others find us, and it lets us know how we're doing. I hope you're doing great. Thanks again. You're the best. Take care.